Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. For the last year and a half or so, I and the consulting team at IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds, have been working with the Law Society of England and Wales on a project looking at the ethics of in-house law. Through that project, I've had the chance to talk to lots of lawyers who are both passionate and insightful about the job and the ethical challenges it presents. None more so than Sharon Bridglalsingh, Director of Law and Governance at Milton Keynes City Council. Sharon was kind enough to come on the podcast and share some of her insights in this wide-ranging conversation. So, Sharon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about in-house law and the ethical issues specifically that arise for in-house lawyers. But I wondered if you could maybe begin by just saying a bit about your own background. And so you are an in-house lawyer yourself, but how did you get into in-house law in the first place?
Right. So I am a solicitor now it's going to be 27 years later this year that I've been admitted as a solicitor. And I practiced in two jurisdictions, back in Trinidad and Tobago, which is my home country. And then when we moved to the UK, it's fairly evenly split, practicing across two jurisdictions. And how I got into in-house law is that when we moved to the UK, I actually started as a legal assistant in the organisation that I'm currently at, and then I worked my way up to director, which actually is probably the story of many in-house counsel. And we'll probably touch on that later on when we talk about loyalty and dedication to an organisation as part of an in-house lawyer's role.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. I suppose one question that arises there is kind of, so you trained in Trinidad, right? And then you moved to the UK?
Yes, yeah.
Did that pose any challenges? Kind of, I take it there's a somewhat different system of law in the UK compared to Trinidad, or not?
Follows the English legal system.
Right.
But just to give you some idea of the transferability of law, I mean, I did my master's in America, for example. So you can, you know, even though legal systems are different across the world, there's the bulk of it is easily transferable, and once you're qualified, it's really easy to pick things up.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Thanks. So you're an in-house lawyer. So what is an in-house lawyer, and what kind of work do they typically do?
Okay, so my actual role is Director of Law and Governance. So I lead a legal service. So I guess in terms of in-house lawyers, you're first and foremost a legal advisor. That's why you probably were hired, because of your legal knowledge and expertise in a certain area of law that marries up with an organization. So that's the first thing. You tend to be a service lead. So as an in-house lawyer, as opposed to perhaps a lawyer in private practice, you probably have a few areas of service sitting under you, not all legal. So in my case, for example, I'm also responsible for committee services and elections. But I know many in-house counsel who have like human resources or audits or various non-legal functions sitting under them. You are an employee of an organization as an in-house lawyer, and I'm sure we're going to touch on that. And I think you're an ethical advisor. So I think all of that is part of the in-house lawyer role.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And there's a few things there, as you say, which we will pick up on later in the conversation, particularly issues that arise from being an employee of the organisation that you're also advising as your client and so on. I'm interested in what you think the purpose of the in-house lawyer is. What's the in-house lawyer sort of fundamentally there to do in the organisation?
Enable the organization to achieve its objectives. And that word enable is make it possible for the organization to achieve what it wants to do, which is a multi-pronged approach as in-house lawyer, because sometimes that means saying, no, we can't do it that way, or that's unlawful. Other times, for example, if you're engaged early on in new initiatives, it is about the breadth, the blue sky thinking, and probably pushing the legal boundaries, testing things, innovation in law, So it is all about being that person and running a legal service, if that's what sits behind your in-house lawyers who are enabling the organization to
Yeah.
reach its goals.
Yeah, so you talked about kind of pushing the boundaries of law there. I suppose that might slightly sort of concern some people that talking in that language. But what do you mean by that? Because presumably it's not just that you're trying to enable the organization to meet its objectives, but you're trying to enable it to do so within legal boundaries, right? So
Of
is there a kind of
course.
judgment of where it might be kind of stepping a little bit too close to those boundaries that you have to
Yeah.
kind of pick up on?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really interesting point, Jim. What are legal boundaries? Because, we have litigation, there's litigation going on in the High Court as we speak,
Mm.
right? Where there are two legal arguments. So I think there is a bit of a lot of this is not black and white. There's
Yeah.
gray, and we'll come to talk about what sort of characteristics an in-house lawyer might have, and one of them is being comfortable in gray. So
Mm.
I don't think, so it's not as if I don't see it in my head when I visualize it as a legal boundaries. There are hard legal boundaries, of course. And I work
Mm.
within a regulatory environment. So, I
Mm.
work in the local authority sector, it's in the public sector. We are heavily regulated. So there are hard boundaries. There are do's and don'ts. But
Yeah.
I would say that generally that applies to your transactional legal work.
Mm.
But when you're talking about strategic thinking and so on, there is an opportunity to be innovative.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that necessity of being comfortable within working in the grey, then, is that one way in which in-house law differs somewhat from private practice law, do you think? And are there any other ways in which those two areas of law are different from each other?
Yeah, so if you think about it, if you're in private practice, you're one step removed from your client. Right?
Mm.
We talked about this before. If you're in-house, you're employed by. If
Mm.
you're private practice advised in an organization, it's a
Mm.
client relationship, so you manage it in a different way. That means that if you're in private practice, as a generalization, you're lending yourself to be more discreet, independent advisors. And generally, that's what you get called in to do. You get called in to advise on a project or to give governance advice to a board. So you're generally in a very discreet relationship with your client.
Mm.
Whereas as an in-house counsel, because you're embedded within the organization, there's a lot going on. And so
Yeah.
I talked earlier about being an independent legal advisor, but also an ethical advisor, and also being a service lead. So because you're embedded in the organization, you're doing a lot of things, and it's not all just discrete legal advice.
Right. So there are going to be areas where what you're doing becomes kind of in a grey area in terms of what kind of activity you're doing, right? So it's not necessarily just giving legal advice. There's also going to be other kinds of advice and maybe involvement in decision making that are kind of around the areas in which you're working as well.
Yeah, shall I give you an example of that?
Please, yeah.
For example, so if I think about our authority, all local authority, public sectors, and I think all organizations, private sector, with an eye to financial management, if you are a service leader, so you're responsible for delivering a service within, in the most efficient way possible. So in doing that, you are making decisions that could have employment law effects for the people within your service. So think about that. So myself as a corporate leader looking at initiatives probably across the council, where as service leads, we're trying to probably rationalize teams, look at doing things in a different way. And there are employment law implications. So I think, in that moment, it's knowing which hat I have on, because it's really difficult to wear your hats all at the same time. There needs to be that acute self-awareness of what am I doing here? And
yes,
in that case, I would probably, Jim, be then taking employment law advice from someone rather than trying to do that myself, because that's really tricky to be doing my service lead hat on.
Yes.
Needing to make some tough decisions and advising myself on the employment law implications. Because what I really want to do is ask someone who's an expert in that area, who may be in my service or may sit in private practice. I want to do this. Can I do it?
Yeah.
That's immediately like one of the big differences between in-house counsel, who have service lead roles and private practice.
So you've got to be comfortable with kind of thinking on your feet in terms of what role you're occupying at a given point, and presumably also communicating that to the people you're talking to within the organisation, right? So is it important also that it's clear to them what hat you're wearing at a particular
Absolutely.
time?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm also interested in just kind of what the work is like. So I think that's given us a bit of a glimpse of that. But I mean, people probably think of lawyers in general as working very hard, right? Having extremely demanding roles. Is that true of in-house lawyers as well? And what kind of particular features of just the day-to-day of work would you say that in-house law has in particular?
Yeah. So I agree that generally, like if you're coming into the profession, so we have a lot of students come through as work experience, some who've just finished their A-levels. And yesterday I spoke to 2 university graduates, one of whom didn't do law. He did PPE at Oxford and wants to do law now. So we have a lot of students that come in and then say, we would never have thought that this is what happens in-house because the busyness of it, the diversity, and also it is the proximity. So we don't even call them client officers in-house, but the people who are instructing you. So for example, if we're going to go down to court to my children's social care lawyers who are in court every day, who work crazy hours, including the weekends, because they are dedicated to helping. And because that's a public sector values and that's in-house values of we are part of, the work. The work is ours, a really ownership of the work. So, but the social workers are sitting next to them while they're preparing documents. So it's not, there's a proximity of your instructions almost that you find in-house that you it's more that proximity is less pronounced in a private practice. So if you instruct outside of the organization, there definitely isn't that proximity. And so I think that absolutely the lawyers in my service work really hard. They work long hours. We have, for example, one of the features of my role is that I advise councillors in committee meetings, which tend to happen in the evening because councillors work during the day. And it means that once a month, for example, when we have a full council meeting, I don't get home till midnight, after the meeting. So there are long hours, but there is also busyness about an in-house service.
Yeah, good. Okay. Maybe a couple of things to pick up on from that then. I think one thing that was kind of interesting is you said that you have people coming in on work experience and being really surprised by what in-house work looks like. I mean, I suppose so. One of the examples you said was somebody who hadn't studied law, right? They'd studied PPE, but is that true even of people who've been to law school, that they can kind of come in and see in-house work and think, oh, I didn't think it'd be like this?
Exactly, because for most of us, what we think lawyers do is what we see on TV, which tends to be like a trial, and and lovely law offices and glass panes and a lot of high-powered meetings and so on. But in reality, the cut and thrust of in-house counsel is you're responding in real time, and it's not always glamorous. And there's a lot of collaborative working with. So I came through planning law. I was a planning solicitor, and in terms of working with planning officers, physically sitting side by side and working through a problem together. That's what being in-house feels like.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because I mean, we should say probably, I think the proportion of in-house lawyers the percentage of in-house lawyers in the overall legal profession is something like 20%. So it's quite a lot of the profession now. And it's sort of surprising that you don't get much of a view of what it's like at law school, right? You'd think they would be preparing people to work in all areas of the profession, but it seems like maybe in-house law has been a little bit neglected in terms of legal education in the past. Or do you think that's not fair?
I can't say. I honestly can't say. But I do think, and we're going to get into this, Jim, I do think, I don't know how you would teach some of the broader call on you as an in-house lawyer in terms of that. ethics, like we're going to talk about, and so on. I'm not
Yeah.
sure how you would teach it in a
Right.
school. I think you can, but
Mm.
well, I graduated so many years ago, nearly 3 decades ago. I can't even remember what we did.
Yeah, fair enough. The other thing I just wanted to kind of note in what you said is you were talking about the proximity of the lawyer to the client and the decisions that are being made. And I think you used the word ownership, right? That it's kind of you're owning the outcomes of what's happening a bit more perhaps than you would be in private practice,
Yeah.
whereas you say you're a bit more at arm's length to the client. It strikes me that might be something that's quite attractive about in-house law. I mean, maybe not for everybody, but just being able to actually kind of see things through to fruition and not just being like a lawyer who just gives some advice and then that's it. They'd sort of leave it alone.
But interestingly, when I started my role, my mentor was a partner in a private practice firm. And she said to me once that one of the things she misses about being in-house, because she was in-house before, was that you just get parachuted in to give some advice on a project, and then you're parachuted back out.
Right.
And she never really sees, she doesn't know what's happened. Did they take the advice? Did they not? How did they apply the advice? What really happened 2 years onwards when that rolled out? And she's saying that's one thing she really misses, being part of the process from start to end and seeing fruition.
Yeah, I can see that. So it's important to say it's not all kind of ethical challenges and ethical issues. There are some ways in which the role is really rewarding for a lot of people. But what are the most challenging aspects of the role? Which elements of the role really bring challenges?
I mean, I think that it's tricky to stay in the know because there's so much going on. So, I mean, in my organization, we're responsible for doing 250 statutory services. We have 2,500 employees. So, but I hold the responsibility to keep the organization safe and lawful. So you can see already how would you even do that? How do you stay in the know? So that is challenging. How do you stay in the know across the organization? Also, how do you stay in the know of the law outside of it? Because of the busyness of what you're doing and getting pulled into different situations, I really have to carve out time in my calendar to like keep up to date. So that's with law, with just the law. I think also another challenge is ensuring that your legal service, if you have one, understand that broader role of the in-house counsel. So they're not just transactional legal advisors. They're not just there to parachute in and out, like I said earlier, but they are listening to the broader context and perhaps bringing that back to me or to others in the service to say, I'm not sure if this is the right thing to do, so that transitioning of particularly junior lawyers into that, it's a broader role. It's not just transactional legal advice, that ownership you talked about, Jim, you are part of this organization too. So it's not good enough. If something was to land, in my case, because we're a local authority, that had a detrimental effect on residents, I would absolutely be asking the legal advisor on that project, but what did you advise? Not just the law, but what was happening here? What else was happening here that you probably needed to flag, have a conversation about? And so that transition and coaching lawyers into that role can be challenging as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. So you do see it as part of the in-house lawyer's role, at least in maybe in the kind of organization that you're working in, to have an eye on ethical concerns as well as legal ones, right? I mean, to give an example, so we are launching the second iteration of the ethical practice framework in October. And one of the things that we're going to add to the framework at that point is a new scenario, which is set in a local authority, right? And it's looking like the scenario is going to kind of deal with an issue where you've got somebody who's had a lot of social care services, a person in the population who's then died. And there's a question about whether to litigate to recover the cost of the services, right? Where it would be legal to do so, right? And it's, there's kind of no question about the legality of doing so, but the impact on individuals in the community might be quite severe. So is that the kind of case where those ethical issues come in, and it's, and you would see an in-house lawyer's role as including thinking about those kinds of concerns, impacts on people as well as legal issues?
Yeah. And I like your phrase, it's thinking about, because the other element of being an in-house counsel is that you are a team player. And that is, so you don't stand alone on any of this. And it's understanding that you can talk things through. So on that example, Jim, it would have a detrimental effect on the resident, on, against whom you're trying to levy. But if that money is due and owing to the local authority, you have also a duty to the public purse. So what about the residents somewhere else who are paying their council tax?
Yeah.
And they can say to you, but why is that? Why you're not going to levy a debt? Why are you not going to recover a debt from that person? Because we're paying our council tax over here. And you're saying we can't have certain services because you can't afford them. So who made the decision that this category of resident would get a free pass on their debt?
Yeah.
So it's not really ever just, as I said, it's a lot of gray, right? And it's being comfortable practicing in a gray area. And when we go back to legal education, like I said to you, even if you pose that scenario to me in class, like if I was in a, I'm not sure until you're actually in it and you own that, as part of a team, you're really ever going to understand that there is no right and wrong answer necessarily. There is there is that kind of, but it's thinking it through in a very open-minded way.
Yeah, thinking it through as clearly as you can, and really taking account of the range of issues and making an informed decision, I suppose. But yeah, as you say, the lawyer's not going to be making that decision on their own. It's a kind of collaborative decision, but the lawyer might have a role in highlighting ethical issues, and just making sure that people are really thinking those things through rather than just making kind of snap decisions or whatever. Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. That's one way in which in-house law might pose ethical challenges, I suppose. What other ethical challenges are there in the role?
This is probably quite trite to say, but as in-house, it's not just, is it legal? Is it the right thing to do? So not often, every now and again, I will actually take independent legal advice from a barrister or from a solicitor in private practice. And then I do the added on bits of it. So they give me the legal advice. What is the legal position on this? And within that, I might be asking them, so what if we did this? If we did this thing, is that, and that's the boundaries issue we talked about earlier. I might push a lot of boundaries in that legal advice. And then I receive that, and then I'm advising the organization. And that is one piece of information that's helping me advise the organization. So I suppose that, I think if you take that visual, independent legal advice plus in-house counsel advice equals advice to the organization. And what would I be adding in there? Well, one, I have a contextual understanding of what the organization is trying to achieve, what the stakeholders are likely to feel and react, what the reputational and effect is. Because I am part of the organization, I have that contextual position, recognizing that is, there's some general principles, but they're always going to be very unique and bespoke principles that apply to your organization. So you add that contextual. You also know the journey of the organization. Where is it? Is it at that space where it can take those risks? Or is it at a place where it's not mature enough to take that risk and you need to give? So that's the kind of thing, the risk profile, the quality of decision making in your organization, the stability of your organization, the governance, all of that. So your legal advice is just one of the bits that the in-house counsel is taking into account when advising the organization. And that is where the word you use, wisdom, you look for your in-house counsel to be wise about things. And legal advice is just one ingredient in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe it's time to turn to independence then. So I think actually in that answer, you said something like independent advice plus the in-house counsel equals legal advice to the organization or something, right? But that kind of implies that only external advice can be independent. But there's, of course, lawyers are always supposed to be independent, but this is something that is often raised as a really central issue for in-house lawyers, right? In what sense, if any, are they supposed to be independent? As we said earlier, you're employed directly by your client, which means you are part of the organization, but the organization is your client. So in a sense, you are your client. And so somebody might see that and think, well, there's just no way somebody in that position can be independent in any meaningful way. But then on the other hand, you might think, well, there are all these kind of duties to the public interest, duties to the court, duties in the SRA principles, which are there to safeguard the public interest, which one might think come under the general banner of independence, right? So thinking about those duties is in a sense being independent. But so what's your take on this? Do you think in-house lawyers can be independent? And if so, in what sense should they be independent?
Well, I really like your phrase, banner of independence, because I think that solicitors, for all the reasons you've set up, we have, when you hire a solicitor, you hire me with all, I can never shed all those duties that I have. And embedded in those duties, like you said, is the banner of independence. It's about integrity, authenticity. It is about independent thought. So you can have independent thought while being part of an organization. So there's in my head that is a clear distinction. And I'm really clear that organizations employ, if you choose to employ a solicitor, then that is what you get. And you get that every day. That's what a solicitor, that's the person that turns up to your organization. So I'm very clear about this, that within a decision-making scenario, if you invite a solicitor in, whether they're private practice or whether they sit as an employee of your organization, you are buying in all of those qualities we've just said: independence, integrity, ethical. You're buying that in. That is what you get. So whether that person sits inside of your means of employing them, to me, it is irrelevant when you're looking at a professional, the professional duties.
Good. Yeah. So independent thought, independence of mind, you might say, that's really important to cultivate that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's important for in-house counsel to be really aware of, because in a discussion, it then empowers you to say the things that are not, because you think, wait, hang on, who in this room is getting paid to think about these? It's me. So I need to say it, even if it's awkward, even if it's not, if it's going against the flow. So that comes back to your independence, right? Because that absolutely is your contract of employment with organization. Be a good solicitor. And a good solicitor is, by definition, as you said, sits under the banner of independence.
Great. Yeah. Also worth noting that there's a couple of ways in which in-house lawyers aren't unique in this respect, right? So there's lots of other professionals who are directly employed, or typically directly employed by organizations like accountants, maybe engineers, for example, and all of these are supposed to have professional independence in some sense. So a lot of other professions kind of maybe struggling with that issue as well. And also, it's not like independence isn't an issue for private practice lawyers as well, right? So they might not be directly employed by their client, but they're still paid by their client. And there are plenty of cases in which, they might have a particularly big client who's therefore in a position to kind of cause their firm a lot of trouble if they kind of remove their customer, whatever it is. So, so they also have to think about these issues. Another area in which ethical issues might arise, or are often said to arise in in-house law, is with regard to competence. So I think we've had a kind of, you've given us a picture of what in-house law is like, and it often involves giving advice or having conversations about all sorts of different areas of law, and sometimes kind of areas which aren't really directly legal in nature. So in-house lawyers are kind of generalists in a sense, right? You have to know enough about quite a lot of different subjects.
Yes.
Does that ever kind of create situations where you're thinking, I'm acting maybe slightly at the bounds of my competence here, and I have to make a judgment about whether I can really advise on this, or whether I need to go to external counsel or something like that?
Yeah, all the time. All the time you're thinking about that. So in my case, for example, I have 5 teams that sit under me, and 2 heads of legal. So and that is deliberate. So I would say each of those 5 teams is headed by, I call them my expert lawyers. So, for example, I am not a procurement lawyer, and we constantly have procurement law issues, as you'd expect, being in the public sector. And the example I gave earlier, it is very normal for me in a project meeting to have my subject experts advising me. And that might be a mix of private practice and or in-house. If I have that in-house expertise, then those people sit in. And that allows them to be the independent legal advisor, even if and it allows me to be able to, as I said earlier, plug that in to some of the broader context.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yeah.
So sometimes, so absolutely, I'm always thinking, and also remember, you need your critical friend as well, whether that comes from within your service or maybe outside. So one of the biggest allies of an in-house counsel is knowing who to call to just bounce something off of, and it 9 times out of 10, that's not going to be necessarily a legal point. It's more, this is happening. What do you think? What's a sniff test on this? You know, how do you feel? Have you seen this happen elsewhere? What do you think? So you're always conscious. I think we talked about this earlier, which hat you're wearing when you are in the room, and that you may also, if it's not in your area of competence, then you do need, and you think you need legal advice, then yeah, you need to acquire that. Now, it's not so straightforward, right, Jim, because we know examples, we see them in the news where maybe the organization is not open to that. Maybe the pressure is on that sole in-house counsel to be the jack of all trades. And I imagine that is a very difficult position for some in-house lawyers who, if the organization isn't open, if they expect the answers to come from one person all of the time, regardless of the area and of competence. Maybe there isn't budget for external advice.
Yes.
So it has to, I can see that would be an extremely tricky position to be in.
Yeah, I think it can be quite challenging. Yeah, so if you're faced with a situation, perhaps it's less likely to happen in a local authority. I don't know, maybe that's wrong, but one can imagine, particularly in a small organisation where budgets are particularly tight, right, that you might be in a position where you'd really like to go for external advice, but you're just being told that that's not possible. So you just have to kind of do your best on the question you're being asked.
But I mean, I don't have unlimited budget, right?
No,
so
of course.
It's really about, and again, that is about how you resource things. And being proactive in seeing what the issues are and what you yourself might need to brush up on. And there are many different ways to come up to speed with things, especially in the world we live in. Webinars, everything's available on the internet. You can you use your professional subscription. So if part of the role of the in-house counsel is always being proactive, where the organization wants to go. Right. You don't need for it to get there to ask you for advice. You preempt that advice that you need, and then you ask yourself, well, how would I get that? And and if it means, then you need to brush up on it. You need to come up and speed on it. And one of the things I'd always say, and I say this to law graduates, is you have all the skills, right? The knowledge, you can always acquire knowledge. You just expose yourself to it. But the skills of being able to take large amounts of information and at pace dissect it and be critical and analytical and summarize and come to a judgment is what we do. It's what an LLB equips you to do. So and you can apply that to different subject areas. And I'm not saying that to undermine subject experts at all, but as an in-house counsel, it gives you enough confidence to at least have the preliminary conversations on things.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a way in which in-house lawyers are a bit similar to GPs or like primary care in medicine, right? So you are a generalist. You have to know a lot about, so you might have to do a bit of research to kind of understand what's being presented to you, and you have to make judgments sometimes about when to refer to a specialist, but there's a lot that you can just deal with as a generalist, right?
Exactly, because don't forget, the beauty of in-house counsel is you can manage risk in your head. The risk for the organizer, you're thinking about the risk. So is this a big issue? Or is this, and so you don't need to throw everything at every issue that comes your way. You don't need to be the expert in every area of law that comes your way. You can make, like you said, a generalist position.
Yeah.
You could give some generalist advice.
Good. Okay. And maybe just to kind of, I suppose this is to revisit something that we picked up a little bit on earlier, but are there issues relating to the boundaries of the role? So you talked about kind of having to sometimes step outside the role of being a pure legal advisor, right? And it's about kind of knowing what hat you're wearing in a particular conversation or whatever. But sometimes people say, I've heard this phrase, lawyers advise, the client decides, right?
Yes.
So that's sometimes set out as a really clear division of labour between the professional and their client. But you're saying that you can't really have that clean a division in-house, is that right?
That is a very good question, because in practice, Jim, you're doing both. So you have that close proximity, you're getting those instructions, but you need authority to act. And sometimes if you're too embedded as part of a team, you could go native, right? And you forget that, no, hang on, there still is a professional relationship here and I need instructions. I can't make up my own instructions to go out to court or whatever. And how that plays itself out in public sector, for example, it's called the ultra-virus doctrine, which is you acting without authority. So the right person hasn't made the decision. And so most organizations, private and public, you have a scheme of delegation. And it says who can make certain decisions. Well, it's very pronounced in public sectors, you would imagine, for obvious reasons. And if the right person hasn't instructed, then the solicitor's acting outside of their authority. And that is very tricky in practice, because don't forget, you take each client officer, as you find them. And some are more experienced than you in your area. So when I was a planning solicitor, there'd be some planning officers I was dealing with who knew the law better than I did, because they'd been doing planning. They'd been in planning for so long. And I was a junior planning solicitor. And then there are other officers who don't know that. And so part of what you're doing also is, you're protecting the organization at all points in time and getting clear instructions. It could get blurred. And sometimes solicitors can overreach, because if you're dealing with somebody who's less experienced than you, you're almost saying to them, no, what you need to do is this. What we've done in the past is this, because you're bringing that corporate memory as well. So you're saying, what we normally do here is this. But really, it's a planning officer's decision, what they want to do. And so sometimes solicitors can, in a house setting, you can overreach without even realizing you are.
Okay.
And so that is why I say, in-house counsel, you are always thinking about governance. And so you're independent legal advisor, but you're always cognizant of the governance of the situation as well. Who makes the decision? How is that decision made? And how is it recorded?
Yeah.
And that's tricky, because in a project team, it ebbs and flows. And then what might happen is, a few months after, you and I might be down in the court and the judge said, and then we can't actually say who made that decision. We knew, we talked about it for months in a project team. We know we all agreed, but the person who needed to make the decision probably didn't. It's not recorded anyway. And so you're always alive to that as well.
Yeah.
It's tricky. It's tricky.
Yes, I can see that. Yeah. Okay. Great. We're nearly running out of time, actually, but I just wanted to ask one more question before we finish, which is, so I suppose, I don't know, some people listening might be interested in a career in in-house law themselves. There might be people who've already trained as lawyers, maybe working in private practice and wondering what it would be like to work in-house, and maybe got a glimpse of kind of some of the challenges, but also some of the rewards of working in-house. But I was just wondering, are there things that you've learned in the course of your career? Did you say 27 years, is it now?
It's going to be 27 in October, yeah.
So are there things that you've learned in the course of that 27 years that you wish you'd known when you first got into in-house law?
I frequently talk to people about our professional ego. And I think that, we all, as you mentioned earlier, each profession, you can kind of tell, there's a type, you can tell how people present themselves sometimes, what maybe their training has been.
Right.
And I think that for for solicitors, it is that, jump in quality with the legal advice. But I think what I've learned over time is the power of humility and observing to gather knowledge rather than something being black and white and written. And there's a lot of, I talked about this before, it's about that practicing in the grey and recognizing that legal advice within an in-house setting is only ever one of the ingredients in a decision, rather than it being, in others, if you are, for example, in court, it's all legal, right? Like you're having legal arguments, whereas in the in-house setting, it's more than that. So I think humility and powers of observation and what's really happening, what are people really saying? And I think also that it's okay for things to be tricky and difficult, and learning how to navigate and exist in tricky and difficult spaces is also something that I guess you have to go through it to learn it, to yes. But I would say those are probably my two takeaways at this stage of my career.
Great. That's fascinating. Thank you. So that's all we've got time for. Just before we finish, I just wanted to put a plug in for the ethical practice framework for in-house solicitors, which this episode of Ethics Untangled is kind of connected to, and it's work that I've been doing over the last year and a half or so. That is available to anybody. So we'll put a link in the show notes, but if you just search for ethical practice framework, in-house solicitors, Law Society or something like that, you'll find that on the Law Society's website. So anybody who's interested in in-house law, either from the perspective of being an in-house lawyer themselves, or from the perspective maybe of being someone who works for an organisation who has an in-house lawyer, or who might be thinking about getting an in-house lawyer in the future, might want to go and have a look at that, or anybody who's just interested in the issues, really. So as I say, we'll put a link in the show notes to that, but that's about it. So Sharon Bridglalsingh, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.